Well, hello and welcome to our Center for Learning and Organizational Change Innovator Series event, Designing for Change. My name is Kimberly Scott. I'm the director of the center and the master's program for learning and organizational change at Northwestern University. We're glad to have you with us today, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel discussion. Before I jump into our program, I do want to quickly thank the folks at the Catalyst Ranch for always being such great hosts. I don't know if they've all left the room now, but Eva, Meredith, Michael, I think Daniel, others, thank you so much for being such great hosts and giving us this lovely space to gather in. And if you can please help me thank them by your applause, maybe they'll hear you. I'd also like to acknowledge you and our audience who are going to be participating during today's discussion, whether you knew that or not. There are note cards distributed throughout the room. Hopefully you see some index cards. You have the pin from downstairs. And we're going to be inviting you to write your questions on the note cards and hold them up and wave. And we have somewhere, Selena and Arpita. They may still be downstairs. Oh, there's Selena. Wave, Selena. And is Arpita here too? Where are you, Arpita? She's still downstairs. We have Keely. Keely can wave. And we also have Jeff Merrill and Terry Kramer, staff of MSLOC, as are the graduate assistants here. We have approximately 95 students now in our master's program, and many of them are here today. MSLOC students, current students, stand up and wave to everyone. There you go. Yay. We also have many alumni of MSLOC, alumni. They're always, you should be proud to say you're alum now. You can stand up and wave. There you go, Corey. Come on, alumni. And of our predecessor programs, organizational development and workplace learning and corporate training and development. Those are also programs that were affiliated with MSLOC. You guys wave, where are you? No, there's one back there. There we go, some more up here. Okay, and we have faculty of MSLOC here today as well, already working on integrating design and change. One of them up here in the panel, Dory. I know, Dory, is there anybody else here, faculty member who I didn't see? Hello, and Cecilia, hi, welcome. And we have center friends, organizational partners, others in the community who are here to join us. That would be everyone else who hasn't waved yet, so wave. All right, fabulous. Well, glad to have you here. And now for our panel, whom I credit for having this sold-out event today. We have about 80 people who've registered and showed up today. So we have Jeannie Olson down here at the end. We have Jeannie. She's one of our MSLOC faculty members. She specializes in learning, human factors, participatory design. She also teaches at Northwestern Siegel Design Institute. Thank you, Jeannie, for coming. We have Shannon Ford, an interaction design expert. She's also the founder of Motif, a Chicago firm that focuses on user experience. Thank you, Sharon. We have Kelly Costello, who's a research discipline practice lead and user research expert at IA Collaborative, a firm specializing in innovation strategy and product design. And we have Andrew Burrows, an engineer partner and leader in IDEO, a consulting firm focusing on human-centered design, and they've recently started to expand that practice into the social sector. So thank you, panelists, for coming today. Help me. Okay, so one objective of our session today is to introduce you to some of the key design tools, techniques, and practices that are used in design, and particularly around product, service, and interaction design. Now, when I'm referring to design for today, keep in mind I'm specifically referring to the design fields based in architecture, space design, engineering, product design. So I know many of us already think of ourselves as designers in our change practice. We do instructional design, we do organizational design, but I'm adopting a much narrower definition today when I refer to design to specifically concentrate on those areas. With so much of the conversation about design thinking happening at the abstract level, we wanted to get a little bit more deeper into that notion of design thinking and understanding some of the tools, practices, and techniques that designers use with their clients. So you'll get to hear from these experts and how they approach design with their clients to solve product design challenges and some of the other challenges that they've been asked to address. And then after we've established our common vocabulary and definition, we'll talk a little bit more, about application of design to organizational change and how those practices might be applied to organizational challenges. So our overarching question that led to the event today is, how does change and design really come together? And let's see a show of hands here. How many of you think of yourself as organizational change practitioners? Okay, so most of you are organization change practitioners. How many of you think of yourself as the designer? Okay, good. So we're already starting to mix it up a little bit. We wanted to see how change and design can come together. And as the panelists and I have had conversations about this and how change and design can really merge, I've been struck at how much overlap there is in some of the practices that they've described and some of the practices I've used in organizational change and change management. So my background is in applied psychology and organizational behavior, and so much of what I've learned is grounded in the behavioral sciences and in the management sciences. So many of you with backgrounds in HR, organizational development, HRD, management consulting, you will have had similar training as well in the behavioral sciences. And as many of the designers also have been, to some extent, trained in the behavioral sciences too, many user research practices are also grounded somewhat in some of the research techniques that we learn in the behavioral sciences. So design methodologies and change methodologies really do come together, and in some cases, we might simply be using different terms to refer to the same thing. Now, I have a tendency to think in terms of images, and as I was preparing for this, a little jingle came to mind, and so I found this little video clip that I'm going to share with you to maybe explore one way that design and change might come together, at least metaphorically.
Chocolate.
Peanut butter. Hey, you got your chocolate and my peanut butter.
You got peanut butter on my chocolate.
What? Delicious.
Two great tastes that taste great together. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Real milk chocolate, delicious peanut butter.
Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
And Reese's Crunchy Peanut Butter Cups, topped with chopped peanuts.
How many of you remember when that actually came out, right? I just couldn't get that out of my head. Or in our case, it's, hey, your design methodology is in my organizational change tools, or your organizational tool is in my design methodology. But, you know, I think there are some really great synergies that can be found in bringing these two things together. But there are also some potential disasters that we might want to avoid. I think as we've had our conversation, we've agreed that not always they translate one so well into the other. One practice used in the design world may not apply as easily into organizational change. So we want to avoid this disaster over here on the right-hand side, which might be very well delicious, chocolate cake covered in chopped Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, but in an actual practice, it might not come out exactly as you anticipated. So our third objective today, then, is to explore some of these synergies and the challenges that might come from trying to apply some of this design thinking and these design tools to organizational change. So we asked our panelists to begin the dialogue already. Our first question that we asked them was, it's jumping ahead on me here. What is design thinking? And hopefully you all read the responses on the CLOC blog site. Here's just a summary of some of them, and I'm sure you can see them. Focusing on forms, relationships, human interaction, willingness to try new things. You know, some of the themes that came from this had to do with dealing with ambiguity and complexity. There were some comments around design thinking being the application of design tools. But so what does that actually mean? What does it mean to apply some of these design tools to organizational thinking? So that's the next question then for our panelists. And what I've asked them to do is to pick a specific design tool, technique, practice, or principle that they use in their consulting with their clients, and describe for us how that works so we can learn a little bit more about that, and then we can start the dialogue about how we actually apply this to organizational change. Now, as they're giving their presentations, I'd love for you to take that opportunity to write on your note card any of the questions that you have. Please try to write one question per card. You can identify yourself, If there's a specific panelist whom you would like to have answer that question, please note that on the card. And we'll have Selena and Arpita and possibly Keely, if whoever we have. There's Arpita. Hi, Arpita, wave. Okay. They'll be around to pick up your cards for you. And we'll be sorting them and hopefully getting through as many of these cards as possible. Toward the end of our session, we're hoping we'll have a little bit of time for those of you who want to have a more elaborate comment or conversation with the panelists. We'll invite you to come up here over to the side. I'll hand you the microphone and we can begin the dialogue. We'll get through as much as we can, and any remaining questions that we weren't able to get to, we'll keep the dialogue going on our CLOC blog. Okay, so let's get started with our panelists. Jeannie will be sharing with us techniques that she's used from user research, framing, and engaging the client, followed by Shannon, who will then explain concepts of diverging and converging. Kelly will then present, whoops, jumped ahead again. Kelly will present about frameworks and visualization techniques, and then finally, Andrew will talk about prototyping. So that's the flow of our conversation, and I'm going to hand it over to Jeannie.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kimberly. Oh, it's like hearing I was going to say the voice of God, but I'm certainly no. That would be a bad. That's a bad analogy. Let's just leave that lie. Hi, I'm Jeannie Olson, and I teach I have the privilege of teaching at Northwestern University in the MSLC program. And when we were deciding what tools and methodologies we would cover here today, I got the great good luck of choosing user research. And describing user research in 10 minutes is kind of like going through the whole Beatles catalog in one song. So I'm going to try to distill this down for you into some basic overarching principles and show you kind of how I see it connecting to what we do in organizational change. The overarching principles are to look at what people actually do, not just what they say. Our attempts to make the invisible visible. And actually, my colleague, Kelly Costello, is going to be talking a little bit more about that, what that looks like eventually. And using multimedia artifacts to disrupt limiting or incorrect assumptions. So if you're familiar with the world of research and you work in a consulting firm or organization, this looks very like something that you would see in most days. You're interviewing. There's Likert surveys, perhaps some quantitative analysis, there's PowerPoint presentations. And one of the things that human-centered designers try to do is look at what people actually do versus what they say they're going to do. And as all of us know, if you work in any kind of field, those two things often don't completely overlap. And one of the things that is a limitation of doing surveys or just focusing on quantitative research is that you're not actually seeing what people really do. And so we're trying to get the other story, the shadow systems, the stuff that you're not going to see on an org chart, or better yet, what people are thinking, what's motivating them, what have you. Actually, I'm just going to skip through these because these are slides I decided not to use. Looking at people working is not new. Human Factors has been doing it forever. If you're familiar with the work of Frederick Taylor way back when, doing time and motion studies, we've been watching people work for a long time. And if you had wandered onto the campus of Purdue University in the mid-'80s, you would have seen me, not dressed like this, but holding a similar clipboard and stopwatch, having to watch what people were doing on a manufacturing line down to the very second. Luckily, these days, we don't have to carry a stopwatch around. We do get to use some really fun stuff. We still go out in the field. We shadow people at work. We walk around. We pester them with questions. We watch. We observe. We immerse themselves in their world. We get to use a lot of fun digital media, video cameras and still cameras and digital voice recorders. We use sketchbooks, journals, etc., trying to gather as many artifacts as we can to bring the world of either users or stakeholders or employees back to a design team or back to a client. It's not very efficient for clients and design teams to travel regionally or to go into offices or to look at the very minute details that we get to see. So we're going to try to bring as much of that experience back to them for specific reasons I'll explain in a minute. One of the other tools, and if my colleague whose picture this is sees this, I'm in so much trouble. One of the other things that we use is our brains. We all use our brains, all right? We're all human. And but here's a little bit different about how a design researcher uses their brain. If I were to ask all of you to walk out on the street, and I gave you all cameras, and ask you to research the parking meter situation in Chicago. A lot of us are familiar with the parking meter situation in Chicago over the past year. It'd be fun. You guys would go out. You'd probably capture a lot of interesting stuff. But maybe not all of you would get the really deep insight or the backstory that a design researcher tries to get. And the reason is we're all human. We're all familiar with parking meters. We've all had some kind of interaction with a parking meter. We've all done parking in city situations. And so we bring with us these assumptions, these biases, these generalizations, or these, maybe we've already been thinking as we're walking outside, oh, I've got the perfect solution before we even hit the street, right? So part of what we're trying to do is acknowledge all those biases, generalizations, and stereotypes, set them aside, and keep digging, keep going, keep going, keep going to get those better insights. And it's not something that comes easily. It takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of self-discipline, and a lot of self-awareness. And so one of the things that we try to do as user researchers and design researchers is develop that sense of self-awareness. So in making the invisible visible, we're taking those design assumptions, we're making them visible to ourselves, but we're also required to make them visible to our clients. Because here we are, and these clients have a historical way of doing things. If you're an organizational change person, this will sound familiar, right? So they have a historical way of doing things, maybe some models. Maybe you as an organizational change consultant have a favorite change model that you love. You're a Cotter person, or you're a 7S person. And so one of the things that you do is you're going into an environment or your client's thinking, oh, so I'm going to look at this problem from the frame of Cotter. And then you get stuck in that, right? Well, we're trying to get to something new, where you can innovate something around or come up with different ideas. And one of the things we do in order to help clients uncover their own assumptions or their heuristics or stereotypes is using these multimedia artifacts. And this is where I have a lot of fun as a design researcher, because when the artifacts are collected, when I've got all these physical manifestations of what's been going on in the immersive environment or the environment that I was just immersed in, and I bring it back and I get to show what I've seen, contrary to my management consulting experience or DNA, I don't walk in with the data and a solution. I may have a point of view. It's always important to have a point of view. But what I'm trying to do versus presenting to or solving for, because this is not what I want my meeting to look like, where I'm presenting to the client, is I want to go around the table. I want to get on the same side of the table as my client and look at the data that's been brought back, and also remain open to the fact that I have one perspective on that, one type of point of view as to what I'm seeing, but just as important is their point of view and facilitating them through what their assumptions were, what their stereotypes were, so that I'm not only presenting data, I'm developing change advocates. And whether that's within the design team or whether that's on the client side, that's, for me, a really useful lever in organizational change. So one of the things that I see user research as being helpful for is not just finding out this information, it's developing change advocacy. Thank you. That's it. All right.
So it was extremely hard to pick one thing to talk about in 10 minutes for design thinking and the design process. So what I tried to do is think back to when I was a design student and what things really struck me as being different from what I learned being a computer science student as an undergrad. In computer science, like almost every other discipline, we design things. We design software. We had a process. We had requirements, constraints, all of those good things. But it was very analytical. It was very linear. And once you found an idea that you could kind of work with and it seemed like it would work, you would just run with it. So the first thing that came to mind worked. Let's go. We're going to finish this up. So the design process, though, struck me as being much more exploratory and much more iterative. And so that's what I'd like to talk about. This is not in the right order, yeah?
Just go back one.
Okay. It's very sensitive. That's a bad design. They don't take into consideration that you're up in front of people trying to do stuff. Okay, so this is just a part of the design process. I'm not trying to represent the whole thing here, but it's a very simple idea. You start here in the pretty blue spot with a place to play, and often that is a set of requirements. In our practice, this is almost always user research findings and needs, Jeannie talked about. And then you are generating lots and lots of divergent ideas. When you've exhausted that play space and there are no more ideas coming out, then you have to converge down to a few of the most promising ones, and then take those ideas and do the whole thing over again. Those ideas are never fully formed and descriptive and complete, so it's time to really diverge out and talk about those and really push them out. So I wanted to give a specific example because it's very easy, especially for me, to speak conceptually and say, of course, everybody knows what I'm talking about, and then they never do. So we're going to use this example here. I'm sorry, I can't turn my head either. Can I put it in the middle? Okay. This is a client who came to us asking us to create a better wedding registry experience. We did user research. We came up with some insights, and we came up with a process model that took the average couple from their engagement and creating a wedding registry all the way through the wedding and what happens after that with all of those gifts. Now, just taking these things as a starting place, there's tons of things you can do. One of them would be to just take one of these individual insights and run with that for a while. Another one might be to take this process diagram and look at each step in the process, or even each one of these individual events, like creating the registry or a shower, those types of things. So to start out with, just for the purposes of today, this is a real client, this is real user research, but the examples I'm going to give you are totally made up. So we've got our starting point. Actually, I didn't tell you what it was. We want to use this insight to the right there. Couples are looking for help in envisioning their life together and then trying to translate that into what stuff they should ask for on their gift registry. So we've got that as a starting place, and it's time to generate ideas. This is a mind map that's representing kind of a quick brainstorm about what this could be. How do we help people envision their life? So what you end up getting is some things that are pretty typical, like it's very easy. Of course, we can do education, we can write articles and tell people that way. Or you start borrowing things. So for example, friends suggesting or recommendations from social perspective. We all have seen that in different places. Or you have things like wizards, which we've all sort of stepped through and had something give us an answer. Or you start to push things a little bit with templates. For example, this is a borrowed idea, but you don't see it as much in this space. And it becomes much more interesting when you start thinking about what are those templates, what's the range of them, what can we do with them. And then finally, you start to push things out a little bit further into personal services, for example, with a household merging service. And this could be somebody who goes to the bride and goes to the groom, goes to the house, say, this stays, this goes. What else do you guys need to make a complete picture? So we've generated a bunch of ideas, and now we need to converge down into the most promising ideas. So how do we generally do this? This is something where sometimes it's just intuitive. The whole team just agrees that there's a couple good ideas and you want to run with them. But usually you also need some sort of more formalized process. And this is where some of your other project requirements come in. So when you're doing that first brainstorm, there's no way you can keep all of that stuff in your head. 20 different requirements from different people at different levels. You just can't ideate that way. But you can ideate around a specific space and then bring those requirements back in and test those ideas against the requirements. You can use different requirements as a play space. There's tons of stuff that you can do, but it's a great way to manage taking all of those things into consideration. One of the things that we sometimes do is rank. We'll choose some ideas that are easier or safer. People can see exactly, yeah, I can see us doing that. And then also having the harder or riskier ideas and some stuff in between. And that way you don't get shut down from exploring those really interesting new ideas from the get-go. You still have a little time to explore. So then we've got our few concepts that we want to look at. What do we do now? We go back and start doing the same thing over again. So in this example, I took the building a list idea and then started to blow that back out. And what you can see here is you start to put more specifics and more detail around certain ideas. So for example, on the templates in the top right there, you start to think about like what are expert selections, what exactly would the range of templates be. On the collaborative side, you start to think about what are some sub-functions of the idea. So for collaborative, you could have couples shopping in real time together, or you could have them shopping at different times and sort of putting together a little group of things that they want their significant other to look at. And then, of course, you might want something to resolve any conflicts that come up with those choices. The other thing that you often see is some little things creeping back in from your first brainstorms. So in this example, templates was a different thing in the beginning, and now it's been enfolded underneath building a list. So the big takeaway, I think, here is going back to the beginning, you don't want to go with the very first idea that you come up with. The idea is to really stretch yourself and push and think of a lot of good ideas, and then to use an iterative process to try to come down, excuse me, and find the best ideas. And then you're always exploring until you run out of time, run out of resources, or you think you really have something to go with. The other thing is I purposely did not talk about ideation methods, how you come up with all of those ideas that are in the mind map. And there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of controversy out there. So wanted to stay away from that. But I do want to say that and leave you with the idea that don't shortchange this process. We can spend easy 6 weeks just doing the user research and coming up with a model, and then there's an expectation that 1 3-hour group brainstorm will give us the answer, and that is just not going to happen. So give it some time, give it some thought, use different play spaces, use different techniques, and then sort of go to town on it from there. Thank you.
The official handoff. I'll try not to be trigger happy here. I'm Kelly Costello, as Kimberly mentioned, from IA Collaborative, and I have a background in visual communication and anthropology, and oddly enough, a master's of design, although I'm not a designer. I'm just a person who likes to talk about design a lot. So as Shannon mentioned, it was hard to pick a topic, and I decided to look more closely at frameworks, which are diagrams. And I'll actually go to my presentation, and that'll help you keep up with me. Diagrams that aid design thinking and communication. So they're part of the process as you go through the overall design process, and then they help you communicate findings to clients. Now there's a world of different types of frameworks, but for the most part, in design thinking, we tend to settle on a few common frameworks that help us describe the overall user experience. The first of which is the user journey. So when you're looking at a topic, what is the journey that the user is experiencing from the beginning to the end? So as you're designing your overall research plan, you make certain that you think of all those steps. And so Shannon showed you a process model, and she really chose one piece of that, so we're going to dive in on this. You can also look at the overall process and analyze it to say, hey, where is the best opportunity in this? Where is the whole process really broken? So the user journey is a really important place to start and a common place for us. The next are the influencers. So for any journey, there are things that impact people's experience along the way, whether they're barriers to adoption or whether they're closely held belief systems. There are a lot of different things that impact your decisions as you go through a process model. And then third, the personas. Anytime that you look at a process or you consider an experience, you really have to think about the people in that experience. Who are your target user groups? What are they like? What are their characteristics? What are they passionate about? And thinking about that as you go through the innovation process. And then the last is the solution systems. And what's nice about using a framework when you're designing solutions is it helps you be more holistic. You don't come up with just point ideas. You have a number of things that you're trying to think about as you come up with solutions and opportunities. So in general, I took a lot of thousands of different kinds of frameworks and shoved them into these 4 models because I thought it would simplify things to communicate today. And I'm certain that you can come up with a few that aren't here. But for the most part, it really distills down into these very common modes of thinking. These particular frameworks were all part of a project that IA did with the NRFC, the Nutrient Rich Foods Coalition. And that includes everyone from meat producers to farmers. There's a little bit of anyone that makes food that ends up on your table could be a member of this coalition. And I understand that one of the groups is actually doing a project going from the farm to school, so you might find this particularly interesting. So all of these frameworks were used in the process of that particular project. And I'll go into a little more detail on each one. The first of which was the user journey. So our task was to look at 300 million Americans and think about helping them to eat more healthily. So it's a relatively high charge, and there is a food pyramid out there. But it didn't seem like people, they knew about the food pyramid, but they weren't certain how to use it in their everyday lives. Like, you know, how often when you're eating your lunch, you go, okay, how many pieces of the food pyramid do I have here? It's sort of this abstract thing that we teach children and hope that they occasionally eat a vegetable, and then you may not see it for the rest of your life, occasionally a poster here or there. So how do we really make that part of people's everyday decision-making process and make them more aware of their options? We came up with, after going into people's homes and eating dinner with them and shopping with them and seeing the whole process, we came up with the food decision cycle, kind of going from the very beginning, information gathering and internalizing that information, to those situations where you actually shop for food and eat it. So shopping, planning, shopping, and eating. And this is kind of the overall process model. But in the process of building that process model, we said, well, you know, not everything on this process is equal, so to speak. The things on the outer ring you kind of do all the time. And the things on the inner ring are really part of that everyday food journey. We'll go into a little more detail about how we use that interplay between these two systems by first looking at the outer ring, which are the influencers that we kind of talked about before. This is your belief system. This is everything from what your mother taught you when you were eating dinner to what your doctor tells you when you go in with your high cholesterol or high blood pressure, or, you know, watch this, don't eat that. All these different factors that go into your everyday food decision making. So those are the influencers that we identified, and then we also talked about what are the everyday situations that people go through and understanding this journey in a lot of detail. And what we came up with after looking at many people and their everyday decision making was that they basically fell into 4 categories. If they really had defined belief systems on the right, they fell into the right side of the quadrant, or undefined belief systems on the left, or they were highly influenced by situations or low situational influence. And what we tend to do in this type of research is not sort of quantify people by demographics. We're usually looking at behavioral drivers and trying to understand what are their characteristics, what are they passionate about. So when we talk about personas, we're usually modeling them on these types of characteristics and attributes. And then we used that understanding to create a whole new way to look at nutrition and get people to think about decision-making models. So this was sort of the new universal icon to identify nutrient richness in any and every food. So you see sort of, we use the same colors as the food pyramid to not start from scratch, to sort of use the model that everybody learned in kindergarten. For those of you that remember that purple were meat and beans or yellow were grains. So you look at this icon, something about it's a little bit familiar, but it can be used in a lot of different ways. With this model, you can now think not only about the richness, the more rings, the richer it would be, but also the serving of each one, all within the same model, so that when you see it actually used in a solution, let me show you, and I think it'll drive home a little bit more here, is that if it's got 4 rings, it's pretty healthy. It's 4 out of 5. But if it has 5 rings, like the 1% milk, a little bit healthier than the whole milk, then it has all 5 rings intact. So that immediately, as soon as you saw all 5 rings, you're like, oh, this is the best one to choose. You don't have to think. You don't have to look at all the labels. You just immediately have an icon that you can use to make a decision at shelf. Or when you're home and you're trying to plan meals for the week, you can actually see everything that you would have for the week sort of charted against this model as well to say, oh, you know, I don't have enough grains. I need to plan in more grains for the week. Or the last solution would be in the world. I'm thinking about eating a hoagie. How does it match up to the whole nutrient system? So kind of coming up with an icon that you can really use to leverage in everyday life, but the framework itself is sort of the basis of that understanding and the model that we use to not only understand what it was, but to then to communicate to others and give them tools that they could use. And that, for the most part, is how we use frameworks. And if you have any other questions, we can answer them later. But thank you.
Prototyping. You can hear me, yeah. It's quite loud. As I was sitting there thinking, how do I introduce this, I was thinking about this. So if I had practiced this presentation before I came here to time it out accurately, that would have been a form of prototyping. And so one definition of prototyping is conducting experiential experiments that avoid you looking stupid when it really counts. So prototypes really, there are things that you experience. They're designed to learn from, and they can apply to anywhere at any point in the design process. So you can use a prototype. We can prototype right now if you wanted to. But the important thing is you have to be able to learn from them. So the very worst thing you can do is think you're building a prototype when it's actually the finished goods, and it's too late to actually make changes to it. So start planning to prototype from day 1 or day 0 even, and continue that practice up through the entire cycle of whatever you're working on. And I'll get to a framework in a minute, which talks about what types of prototypes to think about at what stage in the thinking cycle you may be at. But I'm going to start off with a quote and then go through a couple examples, and then we'll finish up. So, a prototype is a way of creating an experience that people participating in a design process can actually be a part of. And that's the most likely way that you're going to get real information. If we all sat in our room, in our offices, at our studios, or wherever we are working, and tried to figure it out ourselves, we'd get some close approximation, perhaps, or maybe not a close approximation to an answer that we're looking for. By far and away, the best way to get quick answers to questions is to talk to the people that you're addressing in your design process. Go out and meet real customers as a form of user research. Take them a prototype, have them experience what you're trying to accomplish, and get them to tell you what ideas resonate and what don't. And a prototype will help you do that. Asking the questions will be one way of doing that. So this example here shows a project we did a number of years ago for working on the interior of the Airbus 380. And on the right-hand side, you can see a silly prototype that was done with the people in the team, where they said, what if we stacked up people in rows in the sleeping thing, in the sleeping portion of the journey overnight? How close could you comfortably get to somebody else before it started to get awkward? And I think that's not the answer. How do you actually get in and out of those seats? just questions that come up that you can test very, very quickly and easily. It doesn't cost anything, doesn't take any time, but you could sit there and spend hours analyzing that. You could do diagrams, you could do drawings, or you could just do it and just try it out, and then you'll know pretty quickly where you're going. So a couple more examples. It's a bit dark, but if you could see the picture clearly, you could see that there's a wooden table, and on that wooden table there's a tray with some drinks and some bottles and a little handmade sign. So we had a team in Ghana doing a project around personal care, and they had a question. If we had some products that these women could sell in the marketplace, what would people buy? How would they interact? How would they sell those products? So we could have pondered that question, but instead what the team did is they actually went to the market, they found a table, they set up a market stall, and they started selling things. And they started having people come up to them asking questions. And then we had somebody volunteer to sit behind the stall and simulate selling in that real live marketplace environment. And from that experience, they learned a ton more than they would have done if they'd pondered it back at the office or wherever they were working from in the hotel. As a prototype. They learned something, they tore it up, threw it away, and started over, but they had better information at the end of the day. Some work we did for the TSA. So there's two things going on here. There's a physical prototype which these people are standing in. It's a full-scale mock-up of an airport check-in service area made of cardboard and wood and stuff that was just hacked together relatively quickly. I mean, it's a big thing to build, but it probably took a week or two to put together. That's a prototype. It's a physical mock-up of a space in which people have to interact. And it allows people to go in and experience things. And if you don't like where a wall is, you cut it up and move it somewhere else. And you can start to play around. You can start to adapt your environment and start to learn from that in a real-world environment. More importantly, this project ended up being nothing to do particularly with the space. The space was important, and it helped emphasize, in this particular case, the aspect of differentiating between people who have nothing to hide, people who have something to hide. But what we were really looking at here was behavior, people's human behavior. And the project ended up being a training program for 50,000 TSA workers around how they should behave in the airport checkout experience, regardless of the space. It led somewhere different than we expected, actually. But we probably wouldn't have got there if we hadn't got first to sort of simulating an environment that was new and different and we could adapt and play with. Third example, project we did in Korea for a fashion company called Beanpole. Their traditional image was on the left-hand side here, very sort of formal fashion company, and that's how they kind of like themselves. So this particular product that they're selling here is the Argyle sweater. Okay, so the team was trying to push the client to think more broadly about their offering and their place in the fashion place in the market. So they took a weekend, they hired a photographer, the IDEO team styled the clothes, and they did a photo shoot over the weekend. And Monday morning came back and said, and there was about 10 different sets of these images here. This was a brand prototype. We're testing your clothes in different ways that you haven't been able to get to yourself or haven't felt like it was comfortable for your company to go there. This challenged their thinking and got them to think more broadly about how their clothes could be worn, who they were selling to, how they might market them. And I think it's very, very quick, very easy, not something that anybody couldn't do in this room. But again, it got us to a much better place much more quickly because we learned from it by doing it. So quickly, a framework for thinking about prototyping. On the bottom axis, we've got time, and by that I mean time is the duration of the project that you are involved in from beginning to end. And on the left-hand side, number of ideas. So early in the project, you want to be getting inspiration from what you're doing, from your prototypes you're building. It doesn't matter how polished those ideas are. You're going to build them and you're going to throw them away. You're going to test things and discard them and learn from them. You should be making lots and lots of low-resolution prototypes, thinking of new ways to test ideas, and then moving ahead quickly in those early stages of the process. At some point, you'll have a better idea. You will have converged down to a certain point, and you'll have a better idea about what you're actually doing, and you're starting to refine the ideas that you're working with. You're starting to build things a little bit higher resolution, take a bit longer to think about. And I say build, I'm using build sort of in a broader sense. It might be a service experience. You might be designing a conversation with your customers as opposed to a physical product, for example. And then the last place is on the right-hand side here. You kind of know what you're doing now, and you just need to confirm that. That's the traditional idea of prototyping. You build something that represents the final product, and you put it on the thing. It's going to be exactly like that. And that's what many people think of as prototyping. That's the place where it's too late to make mistakes. Okay, you've run out of time, you've run out of budget. you've run out of options. And if you haven't got it right by now, you're in big trouble. So this is there to just catch those last few little things that might need tweaking. But it's the last thing you want to do. You should have done a whole lot more prototyping ahead of time. And then finally, I think this is really the point of it, right? So it's not about the models or the physicality of anything that you're doing or the resolution of what you're building. It's about the interactions that those models invite and the conversations you have around them. That's the most important thing. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, panelists. All right, I'd like to remind you now that this is your chance to write a question. If you have one already, please wave it in the air so Arpita and Selena can come around and pick those up for you. While they're doing that, I wanted to invite the panelists to reflect a little bit on what they heard and perhaps comment or elaborate on some of these ideas that have been shared so far. So anything that you heard while the other was talking that sparked an idea for you?
I'll go. One of the things that I thought of when I was watching Andrew's presentation was, and watching it before we got here, was I want to re-emphasize something he emphasized, which is it does not, prototypes are meant to be ephemeral and messy and not realistic. And I loved the TSA environment that they developed for that project. And in organizational change applications, we've seen people create environments like, say, take one room and take the four corners of one room to map something, what Kelly is talking about, a user journey for a KM application, and just do it with nothing but Post-it note flip charts with marker, and just have stuff up and have people going through the space and having interactions and talking about what it is, how they would use information in these different environments, in an away office, at home office, if there's a traveling a consultant, for example, hotel room or a client site. And it didn't have to be pretty, and it was put up in like 5 minutes, but it got us to such interesting insights that we would not have gotten to had we all sat at that table and not interacted with each other in the space and tried stuff out and experimented with things a little bit. And that more than anything, I think, is one of the values, and Andrew referred to this as well, of prototyping. It's the communication, it's the collaboration, it lets you test stuff out, but it's much less about the finished product and the pre-production stuff. That's important too, but later. Yeah.
I was going to make a comment about frameworks, and as we just simply, I think the value of frameworks is at some level just a way to avoid getting lost. The design process can get very, very complicated and messy, and things will come up and change your schedule. You'll have delays in the program. Somebody will leave and come, it can just get, who knows what's going to happen from beginning to end in that process. But a framework is a way that you can all kind of get around the table at the right point in the program and sort of agree on the highest level of what's important about what you're working on, so that when you're down in the weeds and you're out in the field testing ideas and you start to wander off, you can go back to that framework and say, are we on track? Actually, is the framework right? Maybe the framework needs to be questioned, but at least you have a place to go back to refer to say, are we tracking in the direction? Are we making forward progress? Do our ideas resonate with each other? Are they consistent with each other? Because otherwise, it's very easy just to say, I see a problem and I have a solution, and that could lead you to wander around for months in the dark, sort of like just going from one step to the next to thinking of new ways to solve problems without necessarily having something to hold it all together.
Kind of building on that, one of the things that's happened with clients, thinking back over the years, is when you first talk about your ideas and opportunities and you're collaborating toward different solutions, people are really most excited about the insights and the ideas, the opportunities that are relevant at that moment in time. But frequently, 3 years later, they come back and say, this framework that you handed us, we've now been able to use it to help generate ideas in other circumstances where this still holds water. And at the time, you sort of see it as a device that gets you through this process, but it tends to stay true a little bit longer than your actual solution sometimes. So that's a kind of side effect of frameworks that I didn't originally necessarily anticipate. And also I was thinking about what Jeannie said of this whole sifting through so much data. You've got it back from the field, And just that process where you're sort of rolling around in the ambiguity of just having these touch points where you can say, okay, I'm starting to make sense here, here, and here, and it's sort of very sort of visual sifting through mountains of data.
Great. All right. Thank you. So I have a question here that seems like it might be one for Shannon. What are some techniques to put your biases aside, especially when asking users or clients questions? Is that?
So can you repeat the question?
Sure. So what are some techniques to put your biases aside, especially when you're asking users or clients questions?
One of the things that I try to do, and Jeannie might build on this, is go in really dumb. Act like you know nothing, even if you do, you know nothing about the topic that you're talking to the person about. So that's one way to sort of take that stuff and put it aside. And the related part of that is that you never, ever, ever think you understand what somebody means with their answer. So we're constantly saying, you know, what do you mean by that? Why do you say that? Can you give me an example? All the things to sort of elucidate what they really mean by something and what the underlying issues or values are behind their answer. And I'm often, sometimes I'm doing research with someone else and they ask a question, and I'm like, oh, that's such a dumb question. Why are you asking that? It's obvious. I'm thinking this, I'm not saying it. And every single time that happens, the user will say something where I'm like, oh, okay, wow, I was really wrong about that. So that's one technique.
I would say to build on that, I would say, and we've done a couple research projects together way back when, and working with someone else to develop your questions that you're going to go into the field with is really, really helpful, because they're going to think of things from a different perspective than you will, and also acknowledging what your biases and assumptions are and just putting them out there so that you're not, you're going to have them. Everybody has them, but knowing that you have them helps you design around them in terms of designing the field research and the process that you're going out into the field with.
Yeah. Prototype. You can ask those questions to somebody before you go out in the field, before it really counts. You know, bounce them off somebody. Find somebody who represents, you know, your user group in some fashion, and just test it out before you go out there. And then you won't have to do so much working in the field.
And I think a related question to that: how does cultural background influence designing, and then particularly designing for change?
I'd have to ask, what did you mean by that? Like culture, like the culture writ large, or corporate culture, or?
Cultural background.
My cultural background, or their cultural background. Ooh. I think it just speaks to the same thing. You just need to be aware of your origins and how they influence your point of view, and then make sure that then the people that you are preparing with have alternative histories, so that you're making sure that you are not all coming at it from the one thing. I bounce stuff off of my husband at home. I bounce stuff off of my sister, who's in a very different environment. It doesn't just have to be people that I'm working with as well.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things we'll try to do too are personal immersions, because you always have your own biases that you're bringing to the table. So going through the process yourself first, and then acknowledging those biases and how they might be informed by your own cultural upbringing, and just through the process of making it explicit, brings it to full awareness, so that when it bubbles up again, you recognize it, and it helps you just put those biases aside by recognizing them. And I think the multidisciplinary teams are multicultural teams, and probably we don't get quite enough of that. The more the better. But that, I think that's another helpful way.
Try not to do it alone, because what you hear one way, somebody else may hear a different way, and you can compare your thoughts backwards after you've been out and contrast the different ways of hearing the same thing that you may have heard.
Sure. And a related question to that: how does organization culture affect the initial brainstorming process?
So
I remember being in a brainstorm with one of our clients many years ago. We sat around a conference room like the one that I think you showed on the slide there with all the leather chairs around the outside, and I think there were 10 or 12 people around the table, and we each had to take turns. So you went down in a rigid order around the room, and you said, okay, Andrew, what's your idea? I'm like, here's my idea. And then it was the next person, Kelly, what's your idea? And so I had a good idea why Kelly had, if I wanted to build a car, I had to wait for 11 other people to come around before I could get my second idea in thing. So not like that.
Can I say something
Sure,
about that? I think that's one of the reasons why I stayed away from tools to actually ideate, because the tools that are going to work in one corporate culture are going to be different than another. And when I talked about not going in and doing 1 3-hour group brainstorm and calling it a day, a lot of people have different ways of ideating. Maybe they don't feel comfortable going into a big group and sort of giving their ideas, or maybe they need to think about things, or maybe there's people in the room that they don't want to say something stupid. So you have to know whether a particular technique is going to work in your company or not, and sort of go from there.
You know, that's a good point. Your learning curve on the front end is really twofold. Your client organization as well as the users, and whatever the topic area is, because the client organization to that point brings in their own structure, their own biases. So through stakeholder interviews and learning more about them, you bring some of those orthodoxies forward, and you know about them before you even go into the room to ideate. And one of the things we'll try to do sometimes is to help people see themselves in a very different light. So we've even made cultural diagrams to show people all their capabilities, but mapping it in a way that they never looked at their organization before. So as you're coming up with ideas, they actually begin to see that, you know what, we could do this. Oh yeah, because we have so-and-so over there, and they begin to even see their organization in a completely different structure. So I think for as much as you can try to reflect people back to themselves in a way that they haven't thought about this structure before, almost like organizational prototyping, then that can also be a very helpful thing in helping them generate ideas in a different way.
And you're essentially designing the ideation process that you're going to use. So it's a design problem within a design problem.
Yeah.
And I was going to add being explicit about where you are in the process so that people know what how they should be behaving at a certain point in time. If you're on the diagram that Shannon showed where you're diverging, then you know, as we would say, all ideas are good ideas at that point in time, even if they're actually stupid ideas. But you don't talk about the stupidity of the ideas until you reach the point where you want to converge. So making sure people know where they are and how they should be acting is important.
All right, this question's for Kelly. To design a solution for 300 million Americans, how many people did you eat dinner and shop for groceries with, and what number of users makes conclusions reasonably valid?
Well, you know, that's a very good question. When we design these different programs, one, we try to get a range of different types of activities. So as you saw that, we did shop-alongs, we ate dinner with people, and we begin, I mean, at a minimum, it would be 5, and at a maximum 30, because you're learning so much richness. You're really spending a lot of time with each person. The time for quantification is later. This is during that sort of inspirational phase that Andrew talked about. What you really want to understand are the deeper motivations and behaviors. So in our programs, usually, like I said, minimum of 5, usually maximum of 30. Occasionally you might add in store intercepts where you get to find a lot of people in a short period of time and just understand one piece of the shopping experience. So you might be able to do 10 people in a day, but you're really just looking at this one single activity. But we shy away from people saying, we need 60 people and we need them of every single make and every single demographic. What you try to find are people that are really passionate about a topic, or extreme users, or somewhere where you really know that you'll get that opportunity to have a richer picture of their lives and their needs.
Great. And related to that somewhat, how do you avoid defective decision-making when you're narrowing down on the right idea? So we've been talking a lot about collecting information and talking to users. So what about those decision-making processes? And I guess if you're doing it in a participative way, you also have to worry about the biases that are coming in from your users too.
Yeah. So very simply put, if you're in an iterative process, it doesn't matter. You can make bad decisions, and you'll find out in the next iteration cycle. You know, you don't want to make too many of those because you'll slow yourself down. But if you're, you know, if you're in this constant loop of testing ideas, learning from them, coming up with changes and refinements to those ideas, prototyping those and testing them again. You only have to go through that cycle about 3 or 4 times in my experience before you get pretty close to what is the right idea. And it's not your decision making that's driving that most of the time. It's the people that you're talking to reacting to the prototypes that you're giving, doing a good job of asking the right questions about what is going to work for this group and what isn't going to work. Then the feedback will be good and you'll move ahead a long way. If you're doing a lousy job of that, you know, the converse is true. You may end up spinning for quite a while and not get there. So, I mean, not that there aren't programs I've been involved in where it came down to a point in time where we have to make a choice between A and B, and we've got all the user input we can get, and like, gosh, this is difficult, you know. And then you start to pull in, you know, more conventional tools like, you know, what's the business case look like and all those things. But if we're talking about designing for users, you got to iterate, and so you will make mistakes in that process, and that's okay. And if you're doing a good job, you'll actually learn more that way. So.
Okay, and I've got a question for you, Jeannie.
Oh,
that
can I
piggybacks on that, actually.
That piggybacks on?
Yeah,
Brilliant.
absolutely.
Okay.
It says, for those of us in traditional management consulting firms, how can we facilitate those communications or the conversations with clients about their assumptions? So it's related, so now applying to actual organization change situations.
Right, and I think this is where getting visual media from the field and prototyping is going to go a long way. And let me just speak a little bit to what Andrew was the question that Andrew was answering, and then I'll link it back to the second question. That it has to not be about you, and it also is not always about your client. So when we stay in a boardroom or we stay in some kind of space and we don't get out and test things with different stakeholders, and it doesn't have to always be consumers, right? Because some of the changes we work on, it's about employees, it's about different stakeholders in a supply chain, it's about partners and vendors, that kind of thing. You want to let that feedback from those people drive the decision making, and not somebody's personal opinion drive the decision making. And it's in going out and testing those things that you will be able to shift the decision making from someone's personal, like, pet project or whatever to something that's more respecting of the other elements in the system, the social system this is involved in, right? And then how do you facilitate that with your clients? I think it goes back to that same thing. If you are able to shift away from the model of it's high stakes, right? There have been some management consulting situations I've been in where if you went into the client's boardroom and you didn't have an immediate solution to present, that you would get a lot of pushback. But it's trying to remain open to keep the decision making, the final decision making, the final solution generating till later, and seeing if they can track with you, if they can stay with you and stay open to looking at other ways of viewing what's going on out there, if that's helpful at all.
Let me add a little bit. One of the things we do, and I wonder whether or not doing these things, I shouldn't say this maybe, but doing these things, and this is no offense to anybody in the room, changes the nature of the consulting, so it's no longer management consulting anymore. It might be design consulting. So, but what we do a lot is take our clients out into the field with us and have them experience it firsthand, so that we're no longer even interpreting the results or the conversations that are being had. They're actually seeing it firsthand, and pretty soon, if you do a good job of that, you can kind of sit to the back of the room, and all of a sudden, it's the clients telling their bosses about what they should and shouldn't be doing, and we're just like, that's right, go on, you know, good, say that again, and we're not trying to convince anybody. It becomes very obvious. I've been in situations where, you know, we work with one particular company where we're out in the field with them, and it's the first time they've ever seen their product used in this person's entire career in situ. Like, they've been selling this thing for 20 years and they've never actually been in someone's home or watched them inject themselves with this particular drug, for example. And it's hugely eye-opening on them. Then they become advocates for change and advocates for better usability and all the rest of it. And you don't actually have to do as much work. It makes life easier.
Yeah, I think advocacy helps a lot, and that's a great way to achieve it. And I think that Shannon talked a little bit about this in her presentation of criteria. If you can early on frame the criteria that map to the goals of what the project's trying to achieve, and then when you actually have the ideas and you start to say, okay, well, what did we say was important in the beginning, and which ones of these ideas really help us achieve that? Because sometimes you can get off track a little bit because people get excited about something that actually doesn't get them to the end goal that they wanted. So I think bringing back those criteria and reframing it and saying, okay, if we want to really achieve greater brand awareness, which one of these ideas will really help us achieve those goals? And so I think, and they might say, you know what, we have different criteria now, and that's okay, but then let's be really explicit about what those are and why we think one idea or direction maps to those goals better than the other.
I'm imagining one of these scenarios like Undercover Boss, where you'd have to take them around in disguise to see how
Yeah, that's not
how they would respond.
I love that show.
Okay, so do you use or see the value in using theories of behavior change to segment audiences? In other words, what comes before your user research? Do you go out and collect basic research first to maybe inform your approach? So, any takers on this one?
I would say that secondhand research is definitely part of it, and one of the things, at least I'll just speak from a product development perspective when I teach that class, one of the biggest missteps that my students have is when they come up with this great idea and they're going to go out into the field, that they didn't just do a Google search to see who else has studied this population or what else has been done, because it's out there. Take advantage of it. So I would say that it's different from the behavioral models part of the question, but secondhand research, yeah, definitely leverage it as much as you can. What was the behavioral models portion again?
Oh, for audience segmentation.
Oh, segmentation. Do you want to take that?
I'm not sure which behavioral models you're talking about, so that would my answer would depend on that. But I think every situation is different as where you start out in the first place. Sometimes, just by virtue of what the client knows and loves, you start with a formal marketing segmentation. And often what we're trying to do is create a sort of mini segmentation or these personas that are really segmented more on behaviors than they are on demographics or psychographics. But you have to start somewhere. Or, you know, when you have 300 million different people, thinking about how to get a range that could be representative, extreme users, give you a certain insight into a behavior that you don't get from your average person, but you still want to know what your average person might do. Or you would use secondary research to say who is shopping for the food the most, and then looking at that population. So it depends on how much time and resource you have as well. So it depends.
And sometimes the client might have an idea about who they think their user is. And you know, part of your job too is to push the boundaries of that. So we did a project with a client who said, oh yes, we have this watch and we know who our core user is and we want you to do your research with them. And then we went out and observed these people and realized that no, they weren't actually wearing this product at all. As a matter of fact, they didn't really even think it was viable for what they did. They're kind of like, what are they doing in this category? We don't trust them. And we had to completely sort of, okay, well then that's not your target user group. And let's think about who is. And we discovered their target user and we're able to really reframe this for them in a way that made sense to them. And because, as Andrew mentioned, they were a bit on the journey with us, we could really help them see, okay, we thought the target market was here and this behavior of the extreme sports, and no, it's really over here. We're going to start with runners and then move through the category. And I think that's one of your roles as a researcher as well, to sort of say, okay, I'm starting here, but I always have to be open to being wrong. And that's a critical part.
Just quick going on segmentation. Generally, I think we're very skeptical about it because you have to ask the question, how is it arrived at? What methods were used to segment people? And if it was, you know, a survey or an email or something that really doesn't get at the richness of someone's life or the situation, then it's only so good. And more than often than not, we've used those and then got out in the field and find they're just wrong. You know, they just don't apply in the situation that we're trying to solve because the methods used to get them, you know, were not anywhere close to what we're actually trying to solve or the kinds of behaviors we're trying to get to. So if it's done well, it might be quite valuable, but more often than not, it's done in large quantities of people, which you can only get so deep at, right? If you're going to survey 5,000 people to get, you know, you can be really certain that you have the wrong answer, you know, because you've got 5,000 people to prove it, versus being, you know, on the ground and sort of adapting and coming up with your own form of segmentation based on the small number of people. And if you're in that process early on where you want to create inspiration, you know, again, it doesn't matter if you're exactly right. You just need to be fairly right to be able to move forwards.
Great. I have 2 more questions, and then it's open mic time. If you have a comment or if you want to engage in a little bit more dialogue with the panelists, come step up front next to Jeannie, and I'll come over and hand you the microphone. But first, questions, suggested strategies for getting executive buy-in for the need for the time, sufficient time in the design process. So how can you convince those executives that you need this much time and engaging in the design processes that you've described?
Because it saves money. I mean, seriously, you know, I think if you look at the investment required to launch anything new, whether that's whatever it is, you know, a food program for 300 million people, that's a big deal, right? It's a lot of money to invest in a campaign or whatever else might go into that. You really should think carefully about what you're going to launch before you launch it, and so that's when you can get a lot of bang for your buck. So design is cheap, you know, implementation is expensive, and let's put the money at the front, take enough time to do it, because that will ensure that your results on a large scale, when you roll those things out, will be well received and on target.
I think sometimes helping them make the translation to a lot of times they're like, well, what are you going to give us at the end of this? And giving them really visceral examples that they can translate to say, oh, okay, I see how that's something I can use, is another piece, because it is hard sometimes. It is a long, somewhat ambiguous process, and a lot of people aren't that enthralled with process. Of course, we all love it and roll around in it every day, but clients aren't always necessarily as heft on it, but they do want really visceral examples of helping see what they're going to get from it and what value it's going to bring to them and where it might get them. So I think that sometimes that helps them say, okay, then I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that over the next couple of months, we're going to get things that will help us make these decisions going forward and have really great solutions to our problems.
And I would say, you know, the bigger projects, it's going to depend on what the risk of failure is going to cost them, kind of referring to what Andrew was saying. But, you know, for the smaller projects, it may not, you're not going to want to spend 6 weeks of user research if the project is very small. It just doesn't make sense, but you don't have to either. And this stuff scales. So having been an internal consultant, having been an external consultant, I'll tell you that having been an internal consultant for a large global corporation, that, you know, I was able to do little things for little problems that didn't take a lot of time, but started to build up an awareness of the usefulness of this type of process or thinking without having to like launch this major expensive undertaking.
I have an anti-answer.
Awesome.
An anti-answer. In a design practice for Razorfish around, say, 2003, 2004, we wanted to sell this user research. It's expensive. It's based on ethnography. It's deep dives. And at some point, I just stopped making it an optional process. So I figured you don't tell programmers that they can't test their programs, or you don't tell designers that they don't have time to sketch ideas. So we just, you know, said, this is our process, and this is what you do, and this is how much it costs, and this is how much time it takes. And people, it was okay. We did user research on like 90% of our projects that we sold, or that I sold, I guess. Because it wasn't the whole company, but it's not buy-in, but it's forceful.
It's the opposite of
the
buy-in.
Yeah. Force feeding.
All right, so one more question. If I have anybody who wants to come up and ask their question personally, feel free to come stand next to Jeannie. What do you need from the organization to implement design, and specifically, how do you expand the capacity to embrace failures within the organization? So because this is assuming you're implementing something that you've just designed that needs to be distributed within the organization. How do you help expand the capacity to embrace failures within organizations?
Panels about design thinking.
Have a panel about design.
Yeah. I think, you know, practice, and do it on a small scale so that people can see, even if they're not directly involved, that peripherally so and so didn't get fired for like, you know, putting together this paper prototype and testing it or what have you. That some people it's going to be very fearful. There's going to be some people that never get over the fear of trying something because they might fail, and so you just have to start turning it inside out a little, for the students in the audience, a little appreciative approach, and figure out what is working and what can you build on. It doesn't have to be an announcement where you come in one day and say, we're starting design. You know, maybe you start with a little bit of prototyping, or you start with a couple, you know, stuff from the field in terms of photographs or video.
The other thing that can help is to help people communicate to different audiences. So, you know, you have this deliverable that you create at the end of the project, and it's not always really crafted for every single audience that they might have. So when they're going into the C-suite and they're trying to get backing from the CFO, we'll sometimes collaborate with them to help them build that communication material to give them the support that they need for buy-in as well. So that's another thing that sort of, one, recognizing your allies, and then also supporting them in different ways and being sort of flexible in the tools that you give them and craft for them to help get buy-in within the organization that can help. There's a few different sort of tools and examples, but.
Yeah. Well, yeah, go.
So maybe turning the tables then. So anything that they've said that sparked an idea for you, how you can see these being used to facilitate organizational change. I'd like to toss that out if anyone's brave enough to come up and maybe share your answer with the panelists. You know, these are the design experts up here. I know there are change experts out there because I saw you raise your hand.
And I promise I won't bite. I'm body block. I can't promise that for Shannon, but I'm pretty much body blocking for you. So if you want to come up.
Yeah, so do we have any takers? Anybody want to comment on some of the things that they've heard and how you might see these up? Come on up, Tanya.
Yeah, we're also open to hearing like that. This is completely bogus. This will never work in my company. I mean, that's authentic, right? So bring it.
Yeah.
Is what I'm saying.
Tanya will call you out on that.
Yeah, Tanya won't have any problem with that.
So hi everybody. I'm always looking for little nuggets that I can apply. You know, I might not follow the whole great process, but I'll take something to make whatever I'm doing better. And as I was listening, I really got something from everybody, and I'm specifically working right now on a little dilemma that's been brewing at my company for a while. I work for Wrigley. And we are trying to revamp, actually not revamp, but design from scratch something that didn't exist before, which is a career pathing model and some values and so on around career pathing for our consumer marketers. And this is a very high demanding, high maintenance group. And it's kind of bucking against some of the organizational norms that we've had over the years at the company. So I'm trying to kind of shift the thinking on what is a career and develop something meaningful. So for some of you, maybe that seems like, you know, why couldn't they don't have that already? Believe me. This is, oh, okay. This is a big thing. So at any rate, so I've been really tested by the senior leadership group I work with to like come up with the answer, and we have to give this to our people, and they want this from us, and we want the answer. So I've really been wrestling with how do I go about and develop something that's a lot more inclusive of the people that this affects. And they're yearning to be more involved, but they tend to be very much behind closed doors with some of the questions and decisions made around their career. So long preamble, but what I was inspired by was I do have a little bit of a prototype model or framework, and so I wanted to kind of get together with some of those groups and ask them, like, does this, you know, how does this look? What kinds of things do you feel will take you to the next level? What are the criteria for you to get promoted? What do you, and see how this might work in what they think would be helpful for them, and the kind of information that they can use and tools that they can use on the job around their career. So actually going to meet with those populations rather than have something implemented for them. And then also, I think some of the things that you guys were talking about, and also around the food shopping, was to kind of understand some motivation behind where they're getting their career messages from. So like, what is it driving them? You know, these are all high profile MBAs from top schools. Like, where is that coming from? Like, why do they have to get that? What sort of types of personalities or beliefs or behaviors might they sort into in terms of what they want to get out of their career and where they're getting those tapes from? So I'm not sure yet how I'm going to make that all work, but those are the kinds of little inspirations I got that I think will make this a much more robust process that will not only engage the associates themselves, but also have a sustainable tool, because we often create something and then nobody uses it after it gets implemented, including a competency model for this very population that sat on the shelf. So that's my example.
Great. Well, and it kind of, maybe the question then is, how do you prepare then people to engage in a prototyping process like that? You're bringing in employees to maybe give some feedback on a design that you had. Is there something you need to do to prepare people to engage in that kind of organizational prototyping?
I mean, I'll say that we've done this at IDEO a little bit. As IDEO has grown from a small company to what feels like a bigger company, we suddenly realized we need to change in terms of how we're organized. And so we went through a process a few years ago of trying to figure out what that should be. And I think we probably failed, actually, at the end of the day, to do it right. But just to be very open about it, I will say that prototypes work great for many things, including inanimate objects that don't talk back. But when you start to talk about prototyping people's careers, people get awfully nervous and can only take so much of that, let's try this and let's try that kind of mentality. So I think you do have to be very cautious about it, because you know, I don't want someone messing, you know, people don't want people messing with their futures in a way that, like, failure's good, let's try it out, see if it works, you know. That doesn't play so well. So I think there is a sort of scaling it down during small experiments. I think being very clear about the length of time that you're going to be experimenting, and when you're going to stop and move into the real world, and that this is just a test, and it's not necessarily going to assign you to some new role that you really don't want or don't like or isn't good for you. And but keeping a very close bounds around it, I think, is important, and not letting it drag on. I think at IDEO we did it. We let it drag on for 2-3 years, and all of a sudden the word prototype became a bad word when we were talking about people's careers, and we had to shift gears and rethink how we were handling it. So
I would say that a prototype, got to remember that a prototype is not a pilot. A pilot is when you've already done all the prototyping. And we often think in the organizational change world that a pilot is our prototype, but then we don't have any room to change it. So, you know, speaking to that specific example, you're going to have people in a room interacting, maybe play acting, maybe body storming, where they're going through stuff that is not real in order to give feedback and to test things. So it's not going to affect their career.
I was just going to add, there's a participatory design process. There's a ton of literature out there. And I think you can prepare people to come in to prototype. You can ask them to do homework or do things that help them think about what's important to them. Or you can just come in cold sometimes. You know, people are pretty good about responding to things that you bring to them that are concrete. But if you get into a participatory design mode, I think people get really excited in helping build things, and then they are basically prototyping. Maybe it's more like a framework than an actual career path in actuality, but I think you can also, in user research, often ask people where are they getting their information. That's kind of a standard part of what you might talk to people about. So I would think that could be very easily successful.
Yeah, and it seems like a collaborative co-creation process might work. I mean, it sounds like you had some materials that you did create and then they just sat on the shelf. And so that's a kind of worrisome in that I guess I sort of felt like doesn't apply to me. There didn't seem to be adoption, Tanya, for what you did put out there, so the participatory design process could help that. External benchmarking as well, I'm sure you've done that, of looking at what other people are doing to sort of help in the space. And I think as much as you can make it really visceral, you know, as Jeannie mentioned, body storming or printing the stuff out on the wall and giving them all big black markers and saying, circle the parts you care about and mark out the parts that you don't, where they really see reflected immediately very actionable things that reflect their passion and their values, or the things that they hate or can't stand, whatever those are, because they obviously care a lot, they're coming back to you and saying, let's do something, I need something, I need direction. And so just making them act it out and making it immediately sort of reflective could maybe be helpful.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you again to the panelists for sharing your great insights.